Takes some minutes.
Right, okay.
Okay. I think takes some minutes.
Right, okay.
So I think we can start, and so welcome all. And so I think takes some minutes. Okay. So I think we can start, and so welcome all. And so I think takes some minutes. Okay. So I think we can start, and
There is a
so
delay. Is that me that perceives this?
okay, I closed the YouTube. Okay, so
Sorry, okay. No, no, sorry, because it was
technical.
it was the
No,
same.
Yeah,
it was my voice. Very interesting. So
we're starting it 2 or 3 times at the same time. So
yeah, no. So I closed the YouTube. And okay, so welcome all. And so this is the first seminar of this new series organized by the Italian Society of the History of Science. And so I'm Elena Canadelli, and I teach History of Science at University of Padova. And I'm the president of the society. And so thank you to the two speakers of today, and thank you especially to Lavinia Maddaluno, who organized these seminars, and also the group, the working group in charge of the internationalization. So Dario Tessicini, Daniele Cozzoli, Erika Luciano, and Daniela Monaldi, so for supporting these new activities of the society. So just to let you know what this seminar want to be, so an informal space where to discuss, and it's important to us of the Italian Society for the History of Science to let us know that we exist, what we do, and but it's also an occasion of knowing more what is happening abroad, so in your research. And we have chosen to start from the early career scholars that are the future in Italy, but also abroad of our discipline. So that's why we decided to deal with some topics that and to discuss also the discipline, the trends, the methodologies, opening a bit the view of the history of science right now. And so starting with the next generation. So thank you again, and I will leave the floor to Lavinia, who will introduce the two speakers and the topic, since she has assembled the program. So yes, you can go.
Thank you very much, Elena, for this introduction, of like the Italian Society for the History of Science, and also for accepting to let me organize these. And I also wanted to thank, of course, all the members of the group for internationalization who you have met. I mean, there's only Daniela missing, I think, right now. And so the first meeting of this new seminar series is about assessment and validation. We wanted to choose topics which are quite broad and quite relatable from like different perspectives and different time periods. Of course, assessment and validations are two practices at the foundation of modern science, and they are sort of articulated differently according to social settings and localities. And so for the session of today, we decided to choose two young historians, The first one, and I will introduce them together, and then I will let them speak separately, and there will be questions at the end, so as to create a dialogue. And so the first speaker is Armel Cornu from Uppsala University and Paris Cité. Armel is an historian of science specializing in the French Enlightenment, and her work is characterized by social, economic, and social approach to the study of chemistry, medicine, and at the moment she's developing a project on metallurgy. And she holds a PhD from Uppsala University. She got it in 2022, and then has been postdoctoral fellow at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia. At the moment, she's based, as I mentioned, in Uppsala and Paris Cité, and she works on the relationship between Swedish copper, the chemistry of metals, and the French Atlantic trade. I also wanted to add that Armel has been awarded the 2023 Partington Prize from the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry for her unpublished, but I think soon to be published, right, in Ambix entry, Senses and Utility in the New Chemistry. So congratulations for this outstanding achievement. And I would like also to introduce the second speaker of today, who is an historian and philosopher of measurement and methodology, Rebecca Jackson. Rebecca received a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine from Indiana University, Bloomington in July 2023. And she is postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. And her work on cases on non-standard patient-centric measuring practices in the 19th and 20th centuries has been featured in lots of important journals, such as Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, Measurement, Perspective on Science, Bulletin for the History of Medicine, and also Nuncius. And this is for us is very important because, of course, we have the editor-in-chief of Nuncius with us today, who is like our very Elena Canadelli. And Rebecca has also been the recipient of an important prize, the 2023 Maurice Dumas Prize from the International Committee for the History of Technology for article, I think, The Uncertain Method of Drops, How an Ununiform Unit Survived the Century of Standardization. So I wanted to thank again both our speakers today. I wanted just to give a few tips, housekeeping. So you are encouraged to speak for no more than 20/25 minutes so that we have time for questions later. And then we take questions. If you, for some reason, cannot speak up, just write in the chat and we will read the question you want to pose. And so I will leave the floor to Armel right now, and she's going to give a talk on chemistry and the mapping of mineral water resources in 18th century France. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me share my slides. All right. Yes, thank you so much for this introduction, these very kind words, and it's really an honor here to be speaking here today alongside also my colleague and friend Rebecca Jackson. So thank you very much. So my talk today is indeed titled Chemistry and the Mapping of Mineral Water Resources in 18th century France. This is, I'm going to be presenting today something that is very sort of based on my doctoral research. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, these kinds of mineral water surveys that were part of the research I did during my doctorate. You can see my thesis here. If you just happen to be someone who's really, really interested in the in the topic, all of the details and the references and everything are open access in my thesis. So if you just really want to read more about this, but here is the slightly shorter version. So I'm going to be talking about three things today. First, about the early sort of popularization of mineral waters in France and why there was an initial need to make a survey of them. I will then talk about one very important surveying mission that took place in the sort of mid to end of the 18th century, the Venel mission. And I will finish by what I would consider the first sort of really successful survey, a chemical survey that was done by the Société de Médecine. So this is what is on the menu for today. But first, why mineral waters? Where was this interest coming from? And why were these very early surveys carried out? So mineral waters have that is natural springs that have some notable properties, whether they be maybe naturally fizzy waters or maybe warm or contain certain salts that had a number of medical properties, were sort of present and had been used for like a very, very long time, at least by local communities in France and the rest of Europe. So what I'm talking about here is really something that began in the mid to late 17th century, when people really started to actually travel and visit these waters, and there started to be some actual facilities organized around these waters. They were starting to become spas. So initially, these kinds of spas were only really accessible for people who just happened to live very, very nearby, or for people of the sort of highest nobility. So there's a couple of like noteworthy cases of the royal family perhaps traveling to a spa, trying to address fertility issues, for example, to be producing an heir. So there would be these very sort of high and very expensive cases of like the whole royal family traveling for several weeks. But even this like early, only really reserved for the elite kind of practices of spas eventually spread the practice of bottling the waters, so putting the waters and actually bringing them to the patients, initially only bringing it to their bed if they could not move, but eventually, of course, this led to a broader practice of actually bottling more waters and bringing them directly into towns. So this is something that really took off during the 18th century, that instead of just being carrying out water from spring to maybe the inn that would be in the village, they would be actually entire bureaus. There would be these like little repositories in cities that would be created, and they would be solely selling mineral waters, and they were very popular. There was 23 of them in total that were created throughout France throughout the 18th century, and they would be selling a host, sometimes 10, 20 different kinds of mineral waters, and they became quite popular. The patients also became a bit more diverse. While the nobility and the elite were still big consumers of mineral waters, the bottles especially were a bit more accessible. So they were sold to town bourgeois and artisans, and maybe some people who were educated or had a craft, but they were no longer just reserved for the elite. And likewise, most of these spas had some charitable missions, so they would be handing out mineral waters for free to a number of selected people living in poverty. So that means that more and more people were actually drinking these waters. And new springs were being found also all the time, because they were kind of gaining in popularity. I have here one example of someone saying, I have had the honor of writing to you within the last month on the subject of the mineral waters which were newly found in my land of Elena. So this is just one out of many, many letters you can find of people discovering new springs and bringing them to the attention of medical authorities. And these waters were kind of everywhere. This is like just a little map that I put together of the origins of the waters that were sold in Paris. So you can see this is already like a lot of locations. We're talking about quite a lot of springs, even by the halfway through the 18th century. So all of this together meant that a number of medical authorities, so that would be, for example, the physician of the king or the Faculty of Medicine of Paris, started to have interest in knowing really what this was about, what these waters were doing, what qualities they had, and perhaps could this be dangerous? There was a lot of talk of charlatans and people selling fake waters or selling just rainwater for a really high price to gullible patients. So in order to sort of remedy these host of problems, there was very early on an interest in trying to at least survey and acquire more knowledge of all of these springs. So the very first mission that took place of this kind took place in the 1670s. And it was entrusted to two men, Duclos and Bourdelin, who were a physician and a surgeon, respectively, if I'm not mistaken. And this was described it in this way. The king has the intent of having all the mineral waters found in the provinces of his kingdom distillated to know their different qualities and to know what they are good for. So this was the word that they used, distillated. What ended up happening is that Duclos and Bourdelin did not perform very many of these distillations themselves. They performed a couple in and around Paris, but they mostly relied on other physicians and other people who would basically themselves evaporate the water that they maybe had access to and send them the remnants. So that would give like a sense of what these waters contain, but it was not a very thorough analytical method. So this is the first survey, and it led to this publication, but this would not be the last. And I'm going to talk about the second important one now, which was performed by Venel. So Venel was a French physician. He is mostly known because he wrote the vast majority of the articles on the topic of chemistry in the encyclopedia, including the article Chemistry. So that's sort of his claim to fame, but he was mostly, he was the chemistry teacher at the University of Montpellier, where he taught. So he was a physician, he was sort of a medical man, but he was a very adamant in the usefulness and the importance of chemistry to the art of medicine. And Montpellier was a good place for that. Paris was a bit more conservative and didn't have as much of an interest in using chemistry for medical purposes, but in Montpellier, a chair was created for chemistry specifically, and this was his chair, his job. So in connection with this, he was given the task by the king to actually go and analyze himself all of the waters of the kingdom. So this time, instead of just relying on having people send the evaporated remains, he would actually go himself to each spot. He was entrusted this mission in 1753 alongside the apothecary Pierre Bayen, who was supposed to sort of help him out with the practical side. They began in the southwest of France and performed some 10 different visits and analyses, which is already a lot. So that's quite a few localities. And so they began. But they encountered some pretty strong setbacks. First, really important to mention is that there really are a lot of mineral waters in France. So this little map that you have here on the left is just a map that I made of all the waters that I saw mentioned by 18th century actors. And you can see there's like a big cluster in the middle around the region of Lyon. And that's just because I happen to do a lot of like targeted archives there. I'm pretty sure that if I had done more archival work in other parts of the country, I would have also found many. There was just a lot. And this was a very high interest to a lot of people. So it was obviously not so easy for a single person with, 18th century road infrastructure to travel to all of these different places. And it cost a lot of money to outfit this expedition. So that was in itself a big hindrance. But secondly, and more saliently, the money that both Venel and Bayen were receiving was coming from it was public money, it was coming from the king. And well, not long after their mission began, the 7 Years' War also began, and France was one of the main belligerents, and France also was losing. So eventually, funding ran dry, and Venel and Bayen could no longer be paid. So the mission ended rather abruptly in 1754. Between 1754 and 73, Venel just kept talking about really wanting to get back to this mission, but he no longer had the funding. So he would only work on it a little bit on the side whenever he was basically on leave from the university, something that perhaps some of you academics will be able to relate to. But he was just working on his encyclopedia articles until 1773. But at that time, the mission took up again. In 1773, the first physician of the king was really interested in trying to revamp this survey because it was already very promising, and mineral waters had only gotten more popular since then. So he was funded again, this time by himself, and he was given this passport. I'm sorry for the terrible microfilm picture, but I just find it very interesting to look at an 18th century passport. And he was again asked to go travel and go resume analyzing all these waters. So he did keep doing that. He met with a lot of people you can see sort of in his correspondence on the way. Unfortunately, well, no, not yet, but he would die basically before he managed to ever finish the mission. Venel died in 1775, I think. So he only died 2 years after he obtained funding again. But his book was really anticipated by a lot of the people, a lot of the scientists, especially who were working on the topic. I have this kind of interesting quote here by Monet saying, Venel was proposed for the analysis of mineral waters of the kingdom, and it is presumed by the talents that we know him to possess that he will enlighten this subject. His much desired book has not been published yet. And you can see many other accounts that I found like this, reading all of these scientists working on mineral waters. All of them write about how much they can't wait to get Venel's book, but he died, and sort of tragically, through a kind of comedy of errors, his manuscript was just lost. It was transferred to his brother, but his brother died, and then it was given to another guy, and then another guy who was really into Mesmer. And then when Mesmer really fell out of fashion, the guy had to run away, and he went to Italy, and he lost the manuscript on the way, it seems. So it is maybe somewhere, and one day I will find it, but the actual findings were never published. So that meant that this entire survey and all this public money led to nothing because the notes were lost, and no publication ever came out of it. So the next time that a survey was attempted, they took a sort of different route. Which leads me to an important institution in my research, which is called the Société de Médecine, Society of Medicine, which used a more collaborative method, not to rely on a single man who could, as we see, become a point of failure. So the Société de Médecine, I'm going to go really fast on the creation. It was first proposed in the 1730s by a first physician of the king. It didn't work out. The plan was shut down. Many years passed, and in the sort of 1770s, a commission was created that would be sort of like a small research commission that would study remedies and mineral waters, and then eventually, through more complicated 18th century history of institutions, it was given patent letters to become a proper scientific society in kind of sort of medical research. And one of the main tasks of this society was to not only be interested in sort of scientifically in mineral waters, but also to regulate them. So this was an institution with some amount of power. And of course, given this task to regulate and better understand mineral water, they also wanted to take on a survey almost right away. And analysis became, they decided that it should, like chemical analysis became a requirement of a mineral water being able to be classified as such. So in order for a mineral water to be an official mineral water that could be sold in all of these bureaus, for example, that I talked about, it had to be analyzed by a competent chemist. I've put here on screen a letter that exemplifies an analysis that was rejected. So they were even quite picky. They didn't just, for example, how it was done in the late 17th century would not have been enough. They wanted a proper, up-to-date, thorough chemical analysis. So what was the method? This is something that I have researched extensively, but they would basically rely on a vast network of correspondence that would all send them a chemical analysis of a mineral water that they lived close by. So they all used not exactly the same method, but a method that is, I think, comparable enough, that has a blueprint that I think you can call it a kind of standard, a soft standard, basically, of all kind of using the same steps with lots of little variants. But if we were to look at them broadly, these are the steps, basically. So the first step was to actually go to the spring. You had to be there in person. And you had to make some sort of physical measurements to measure the temperature, and the pressure of the air, maybe have a look at the environment to get some clues as to what might be in the water. Then it was a really important step that I find very interesting scientifically, which is the sensory analysis, which means tasting, smelling, and touching, feeling the water, and getting actually quite a lot of information through this. This is what I wrote about in that article mentioned by Elena in my introduction. So I have done a pretty extensive study of the kind of vocabulary used to describe how these waters felt, how they tasted, and you could get a surprisingly high level of sort of scientific accuracy on the contents of the waters by just tasting alone. So this was a very important step. Next, I already mentioned these, the sort of physical measurements, temperature, etc. After this, a step that became very important in the sort of later 18th century was analyzing the air, so the gases present in the waters. A lot of these mineral waters were lightly fizzy. Usually today we would understand them to be carbonated, but at the time, pneumatic chemistry was still being developed, so they would have lots of different kinds of methods to try and extract the bubbles and the airs that were present in the water and try to analyze them. They would then, there was this step that was always performed but always led to much complaint, which was the use of chemical reagents. So the reagents were just basically chemical substances that you could put in the water and it would react in a certain way. And the reaction would indicate the presence or absence of a particular compound. There were hundreds of different kinds of reagents. They are in themselves a really interesting history, but they were always known to be very fiddly and to not always work. And but it was still very convenient, and you could do them at the spring directly, and that was seen as more reliable. So they were still very often used. But the step that was seen as more reliable, which would usually conclude the analysis, was the dry analysis. So this would entail evaporating a large amount of water, very slowly, very delicately, so as to not burn anything or destroy anything, and, well, basically eventually get to only the minerals would be left. And these minerals themselves would be analyzed using a variety of solvent extractions and filterings, and to try and basically separate them from each other and get the exact amount of separated minerals and to weigh them. And then you could get to a full list of what was present in that mineral water. The correspondents of the Société were basically the people doing all of these analyses. So that meant that, unlike with Venel, who was a single person, or even when he was in his team with his apothecary Bayen, this time the Société could basically centralize all of these incoming analyses, and that's how they actually managed to get a much more reliable way of making this kind of survey of the mineral water wealth of the kingdom, you could say. And this led to eventually a kind of chemical conception of what a mineral water was. There I have just put the end of the analysis of the waters of Enghien, and you can see that it's said kind of plainly, a pound of the water of Vaugirard contains, and then you have a list of exact weights of exact chemicals, and this becomes what a mineral water is. It sort of becomes this kind of scientific description. And yes, this is kind of eventually what the Société brought about through this kind of intense, this nationwide collaboration with these hundreds and hundreds of correspondents. This is what they reached, this kind of knowledge, chemical knowledge of the waters. So just in conclusion, I know I'm past 20 minutes now. I will wrap up. I just want to talk about a little bit of what this means. This kind of chemical standard is not a simple standard. This is not this is not a very simple case of just applying science and getting knowledge out of it. This is actually a very kind of complicated process. As you can see, there were many failed attempts. And so I want to just talk a little bit about these kinds of workarounds and compromises that were necessary in the establishment of this kind of soft standard. So first of all of these technicians and analysts were working between field and laboratory, and they always had to work with the instability of the product itself. A mineral water kind of decayed over time and changed the concentration. It would, obviously, you could imagine a fizzy water would lose all of its gas pretty quickly, so you had to close it, but then sometimes closing it would still leak, and you can imagine all these problems. They apply to all of the different components of the waters. So there was always a level of uncertainty of what the actual result of the analysis were. So in order to combat that, they very often worked in teams, and it was a lot of collaboration. This was a very sort of like correspondence and collaboration heavy field of knowledge. You can find lots of analysts saying, well, I didn't really know how to interpret this, so I went to the apothecary down the street. He was taught by this guy, so he told me he had seen this happen once, so he thought it was possible. But, dear people of the Société who I'm writing to, do you think this is possible? There was a lot of this kind of discussion. And alongside this, there was also always this emphasis on redundancy, of trying to prove that a mineral, for example, was contained in water through 16 different experiments, and because this was the only way to actually establish anything. And even with all of this redundancy and all of this collaboration, there was a lot of kind of, I would call, transparency around this kind of compromise. People put doubt in the reports very visibly. They did not they made claims, but they also made lots of claims, but saying, we think this, but please be nice to me if I'm wrong, sometimes almost exactly in these terms. And finally, final slide now, I'm on 24 minutes. Up to the very, very end of the 18th century, it was still clear, even in the minds of the regulators, that chemical analysis was an effective way to survey mineral waters and to obtain knowledge about mineral waters, but it was never perfect. So I have this quote here of saying, no matter how extended the methods that chemistry has given to the analytical research of mineral waters, we must admit that they are still always not sufficient to be able to judge with a mathematical precision. So no mathematical precision, the state of the substances which are found in them by the act of underground combination. So this idea that the underground always leads to things that are kind of beyond scientific comprehension was always present. And so this kind of standard was always to be approached with a certain amount of humility. That is my conclusions from studying the mineral water surveys of 18th century France. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armel. I don't know if, Elena, you want to say something, or can just
No, we can just introduce Rebecca,
Yeah.
and then we so at the end to
yeah. Thank you. I mean, I liked really much this kind of like a clause on the perfection of mathematical knowledge, and I saw that Erica sort of Erica faces sort of light up. And so I like to move to the next speaker, Rebecca Jackson, who is going to present a paper on the uncertain method of drops, how a non-uniform fluid unit survived the century of standardization. So we are still in this like watery sort of context, but I believe a few centuries later. So I also remind Rebecca, you can speak for like 20, maximum 25 minutes, and then we open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to especially thank Lavinia for inviting me, for organizing this, and for pairing me up with Armel, who, as you said, if this is the future of history of science with young researchers, I think the future is very bright. So I'm excited to be here. I think the last slide that Armel had up about phenomena that resist a kind of precision, a mathematical precision, that theme is going to be very strong here. So I'm excited to see where the conversation goes after this. So as was mentioned, my talk today is on the uncertain method of drops, how a non-uniform unit survived the century of standardization. So to just give you a quick overview of my talk today, I'm first going to introduce the problem of drops, what made them such a problem, and how minims were posed as the standardized solution to this problem. Then I'm going to talk about devices, devices for making drops and making minims. So that would be the development of the dropper and the minimometer, which is really fun to say. So go ahead and try minimometer. The next, I'll talk about a different way that drops were used in continuous administration. So I'll take us from the open drop method of anesthesia and connect it to the IV drip or intravenous drip we know today. And then I'll end with just a brief thought on why I think it's important that we study non-standard measuring practices. And if I have time at the end, I want to point towards new directions for this project. Today, I mostly talk about the English context. My paper also goes into the American context. But the project is going to have a new iteration with the help of Sarah Hymans and Armel Cornu, who you just heard from. We're going to be looking at drops in the French chemistry context, which I think will be a really rich extension of this project. So to just give you a little bit of a background to paint a picture here, in the wake of the French Revolution, there are these reforms of not just the units in weights and measures, but also the names with which we call these units to clarify which measures you can use when, how to differentiate fluid measures from dry measures. And this is all in the effort of having a more universal and rational system of measurement and easy conversions from one unit to another. The English weights and measures at this time, at the turn of the 19th century, have this cornucopia of local units and long-standing confusion, even for the same substances. Different units were used for selling fluids and powders as using the same fluids and powders in medicaments, so lots of confusion. In 1809, the Pharmacopoeia of the Royal College of London Physicians identified some challenges ahead for solving this problem of confusion with too many units and too many uses. They wanted a standard system with easy conversions between the units, and they wanted to tie the volumetric measures to the weight measures in admiration of the French accomplishments. And they wanted to revise the nomenclature. So to just give you an example, to distinguish a fluid ounce from an ounce. This is important to note because the drop had this uncertain status of not quite being in one category or another. First of all, it was non-uniform, so that's going to be a problem for trying to have a conversion chart. They varied in size. At this time, drops were made by taking a bottle or some decanter and just tipping the side of it until the fluid dropped out on the lip of the bottle. And the efforts at drop standardization were very just kind of idiosyncratic and time-consuming. I read one pamphlet by someone who tried to find the exact lip of a bottle that would produce consistent drops. And I'm not exactly sure what he hoped to accomplish from this, but even after all that effort, then only that one bottle has that drop size. No one else with other bottles is obtaining the same drop size. It was kind of pointless. And as I said, a drop of one fluid can weigh much more or much less than another. So if you have an aqueous fluid, that's going to be different than an alcohol-based fluid. And so it's hard to incorporate drops into this, system that they're hoping to unify the volumetric weights and measures within. At the time, there was an approximate definition of a drop, which they just sort of called 60 drops to a fluid drawn. So this was sort of the approximate definition, but in actual tests, this was pretty far from reality. And after some discussion, it was decided that even using the word drop for any small unit could be misleading and encourage continued usage of a variable unit. So when they sought to standardize the drop, instead of calling it a standard drop, they just decided to get rid of the word altogether and replace it with the minim. So the 1809 Pharmacopoeia introduces the definition of the minim as being truly exactly 60 minims in one fluid drawn. And as you see, it fits so nicely in this table. The minim fits in with all the other units, and there's one conversion for them all. And as I said, drops are omitted from this conversion table. They even considered, well, maybe we'll have kind of a little bit of a definition for drops just to fit them in since they're already used, but no, they decided that this would encourage their use. They're just going to eliminate the drop altogether. The minimometer was the graduated tube that was crafted to deposit minims. You can see this tube on the right, figure 8. It was open on both ends, so if you remember as a kid taking a straw, dipping it in glass and putting your thumb over the top to kind of get a suction action, that's exactly how the minimometer was used. So you already know how a minimometer works, although I have yet to be able to actually find surviving examples of the minim tube. So we should be done, right? Like this is how we are used to telling stories of history of measurement, history of standardization. We had a variable unit, we replaced it with a standard unit, and we should be good to go. But as you could probably guess, by the fact that none of you have probably ever heard of a minim before, it is a relic of the past, while the drop remains a relevant and recognized fluid unit for a range of medical uses today. In fact, if you can include the IV drip, which really is calibrated in drop size, it's the most common unit used in medicine, most likely. It's also used for infant oral vaccines, eye medications, many applications. So already we can see this is a non-standard story about standardization, and it goes against our intuitions for how the flow of progress and measurement goes. Okay, so what happened? Where did the standardized minim go, and how does the non-uniform drop end up prevailing at the end? So a year after the Pharmacopoeia introduces the minim, there's already critiques and there's already problems. So one article from a trade magazine expressed that there was confusion about whether this was actually resolving the mismatch between volume and weight measures. So one writer notes, 10 of these minims of water are equal to 20 of laudanum and of other tinctures and to 30 of alcohol or ether. So there's a little bit of confusion about weight and volume measures. It was also noted to waste fluid and be inconvenient. So one writer notes, It required always that the external adherent layer of fluid be wiped off the tube to prevent inaccuracy, to prevent that extra fluid from going in. The use of the manometer itself limited its applications. So you can imagine you need the fluid that you are dipping the manometer into to be the right size and shape and have the depth of fluid that you need to use it properly. And at the end, there were accuracy problems that because of the fluid adhering to the internal surface of the tube, whenever the fluid is deposited, it's not exactly the amount that was in the tube because some is still remaining inside the tube. So the author recommends a little bit of a design shift. So take the tube and point to the tip a little bit and deposit drops one at a time rather than trying to measure out these minims. And no graduated unit markings are mentioned for this device. So you can probably imagine in your head that this recommendation looks a lot like what we know of as the modern medicine dropper without the rubber top. So on the right there. And this intuition is over time pretty correct, that over time the manometer technology kind of develops simultaneously with dropper technology, where improvements in the manometer actually end up leading to improvements in regulation of drop size. And by the 1880s, the drop and not the minim is actually taken to be the main competitor against the milliliter in the French context. So I have an example from a British medical journal article. Thus, it is not often easy to measure quantities of fluid by the graduations on the glass. The quantity is apt to rise above or sink below the graduated line. Then adhesion may come into play and by a sort of capillary attraction may raise the fluid above the line. And lastly, volatility may deprive us of an appreciable quantity of our medicament. So very similar issues as the tradesman article noted. In the case of powerful solutions, the difficulty is often solved by starting with a certain number of drops and increasing the dose gradually until the desired effect is obtained. So interestingly, even though drops are considered to be the most practical way forward, minims continue to be referenced in practical texts, medical texts, advertisements well into the 20th century. Even though, at least from my research, I can't find any evidence that minimometers are actually being used. It seems to me that drops are actually what is being used, and minims are being referenced almost as like a replacement word for drops to appeal to a sense of rigor. Eventually, the minim gradually falls into disuse and obsolescence, and it is officially abolished actually not until 1985, although its use ceases to be relevant far, far before this. So just to give you a quick overview of why drops have this practical advantage. Well, first of all, they're convenient to use. You're not having to clean equipment after every single use. And this is because the container of a drop is actually the fluid itself. It's that it's the surface tension of the fluid itself that's keeping the drop adhered to the end of the dropper. And this creates less waste in the end. And it's also not as limited in application. So you don't have to have special requirements of receptacles or fluid levels. Like, for example, if you are depositing a small amount of blood, you don't want necessarily to have like a whole decanter full of blood in order to get a certain number of drops or minims. It also had epistemic advantages, avoiding the undetermined amount of residue left in the tube, the ambiguity of graduated markings and adhesion to glass, and ultimately conveys a gradual process and a heuristic for obtaining the correct amount. So ironically, the same pharmacopoeia that denounced drops used drops in its medical recipes several times. So just to give you some examples of what that looked like, they mention the use of drops in titration, a few drops of spirit, in precipitation, drop in as much muriatic acid as may be necessary, And again, drop in gradually as much sulfuric acid as may be required. And you can kind of see how this is encouraging attention to observation as a way to know when the amount is correct. So that leads me to another half of this story, which is, leaving the story of drops in medications in the pharmaceutical context, going to drops within the anesthesiology context. I'll talk about the problem of chloroform, ether, and nitrous oxide. So this is probably something many of you are very familiar with, the dangers of overdose of chloroform. This is due to the individuality of patient outcomes being just highly unpredictable. So you could have one patient where you gave them the same amount of anesthesia and they were fine, and another patient tragically dies. And this is at least partially because the way of giving anesthesia early on was to pour a certain amount on a cloth, hold it up to the patient's face, and just hope that that was the right amount. And because this was so unreliable, some surgeons still preferred to choke or smother their patients until they lost consciousness, as that was still considered by some to be safer than using these chemicals. The minim did not help, actually. So here's a British Medical Journal article called Chloroform Accidents, where one writer says, the use of the minim measure as a means of security must also be put quite aside. Those who have been accustomed to pour upon a handkerchief as much chloroform as seemed necessary, and then hold it closer or less close according to judgment, must often have experienced melancholy amusement in noting the piteous way at which, at an inquest, the exhibitor will inform the coroner that he had given only 45 minims by measurement. Such precision sounds very fairly on such an occasion, but we fear that it conduces nothing to the patient's safety. So precision, even down to the minim, which is a very small unit, it's about 0.06 milliliters, does more to protect the reputation of the surgeon than it actually does to protect the safety of the patient. So next, I'll talk about Alice McGaw and the open drop method. She was one of the first nurse anesthetists at St. Mary's Hospital in the US, now known as the Mayo Clinic. She develops a safe anesthesia method using drops by adapting the German open drop method, which she's taught on a visit to the Mayo Clinic. She publishes 5 papers on her successful anesthetization of 14,000 patients without a single death. And she does this by focusing on the individual patient and gauging their physiological reactions. This was really her addition to the open drop method, is to focus very heavily on the patient, how they react. So to give you just an example of the ways that she describes her method, we commence with the open drop method until the patient's face is flushed. We have a large piece of surgeon's gauze of several thickness, adding a few more layers of the gauze and giving ether a trifle faster until the patient is asleep, then remove the gauze and continue with the same covering as at the start and by the drop method. So she is drop by drop, adding a little bit of anesthesia at a time and looking for physiological signals like the patient's face being flushed, like the patient falling asleep. So what are the advantages of drop administration here? Well, first of all, it allows for this continuous and gradual administration. So the attention of the practitioner can be directed towards evaluating the patient outcome, the face, the breathing, whether they're asleep. And this attention to patient physiology provides knowledge which can direct administration decisions, whether to apply drops faster or slower. So this increases the certainty that the correct amount will be administered, and this, in the end, is what saves patient lives. So here, the unit of drop is actually sacrificing some knowledge. So you're not able to report an exact amount given to the patient at any one time, but this is for the sake of forming other important knowledge claims particular to that individual patient and most relevant in that moment of administration. Uniform units such as minims can convey a level of precision and universality and encourage trust of previously proven trials, But this was not such a good idea in this case. Drops, on the other hand, communicate a certain level of approximation, individuality, and even mistrust of previous experience to apply to the current case. So units are not just serving as tools, as physical tools, but also communication tools. So at a time when medicine is turning more towards patient-centric rather than practitioner-centric and evidence-based practices, drop administration techniques allowed for attention to individual patient outcomes, and that was how they guided dosage. And you can see that this relevance of this prioritization continues with the use of drops in IV administration today. So to just give you a quick summary, because I threw a lot at you very fast, we went through a century of drops. So how is it that this non-standard unit continues to be valuable? So for dosage, for drops in the context of dosage, in order for measuring results to be reproducible, the devices and relevant control conditions must be accessible and usable in actual real time and space. Unit uniformity and unit standardization, like the minim, might help or it might harm this effort. In the case of small fluid units for dosage, the ease of proper control conditions for obtaining drops outweighed the idiosyncratic nature of drop size, as compared with the difficulty of obtaining proper control conditions for minims. And in the continuous case, in the anesthesia context, I think it's good to note that for some measuring problems, gaining a precise numerical representation of an amount might not be as important as gaining the ability to make precise decisions about that amount. We might want to prioritize the process of assessing the amount administered as correct above assessing what exactly the correct amount was. So in the historical case of chloroform and in the contemporary use of the IV drip, knowing how to obtain individual patient outcomes is regarded as more important than knowing the exact input of fluid at any given moment. So why should we look at non-standard measuring practices like this? So one thing I think is important is to understand standardization, we have to understand non-standard practices that are actually successful. If we can refine the constraints that determine when standardized practices are actually helpful towards our epistemic aims, that's the philosopher side of me coming out, then we can better guide practices in science and medicine so that we employ standardization when it's effective and not when it's ineffective or even harmful. In the more historical side of me, see this story as an example of how we can reverse the kind of teleological tendency that we have to tell only the success stories of standardized practices. I think we tend to think that a standardized measure implies a superior measure. And in order to avoid a biased conception of non-standard practices, which I think results from only ever studying non-standard practices along the way to standardized success stories, if we want to stop thinking of non-standard practices as primitive or underdeveloped versions of standardized practices, we're going to have to look for these non-standard success stories to truly understand when they are superior and when a standard measure is going to be unsuccessful. So these are my references, but if I have time, I think I've got 2 minutes. So I just want to give you a peek into sort of the next project that I'm tackling with Sarah Hyman's and also Armel Cornu. Our kind of just broad exploration is how were drops dealt with in the French chemical context in practices and discourse. So we have a working title or two. One of them is Making Amounts, an Old Unit in the New Chemistry. Or I'm tempted to throw a pun in and say gut work. The French word for drop is gut. Making amounts with an old unit in the new chemistry. And I think the reason why the three of us came together for this project is, one, Sarah Hyman's and Armel Cornu know the French context so much better than I do. And also their work on continuities between the mid-18th to mid-19th century chemical practices, I think has been really important, including the use of the senses continuing through the 19th century and the use of qualitative evidence being used in chemistry. And so what we basically want to tackle is a very kind of similar question of, was there an effort to eliminate drops when the milliliter becomes institutionalized? Were there similar difficulties faced in getting the adoption of the milliliter in chemistry, and we're also interested in other contexts potentially. So our kind of very early research indicates that drops definitely continued to be used alongside metric units. But we still need to explore, did anyone, any organization, any profession see this as a problem? And if not, that's kind of ironic that the English apothecaries were seeing a problem that they weren't up to the French standard, when the French might not have actually seen a problem with drops. We're wondering if there is social pushback, kind of similar to Ken Alder's work, with the meter actually being very slowly adopted because it interrupted practices of artisans who were measuring in other ways. So we were wondering, how did chemists, tradespeople, and apothecaries respond to this issue, if there was one? And kind of more broadly along the way, as we've been kind of digging in a little bit, we've noticed that there's just very little that's been written on small fluid units and metrification. And this is just really odd to me. So if you are out there and you have tips on what we can read pertaining especially to fluid units and metrification, we would love to hear from you. Please email me, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. This was very refreshing, especially, I mean, myself, I'm not like a contemporary historian, I'm like an 18th century historian. So it was like really, yes, a lot to take in, but also very stimulating. And yeah, I would open the floor to questions if there are like questions. I have a lot of questions, but I would like the audience to jump in first.
Gabriele Marcon.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I have a question. Thank you very much, first of all, for organizing this wonderful set of talks. And thank you, both speakers. It was really interesting to hear about your research. I have a question for Armel, and I was kind of struck by the overlaps between this analysis of mineral waters and the metals extraction from the underground. And I was actually wondering if you could say more about, at one point you actually mentioned the sort of the problems and the issues encountered by these artisans and physicians, and whether they conceptualize generation and decays. So these are actually words that you use at one point to actually describe the origins of the spring waters and the origins of mineral waters, and whether they actually had some sort of idea about the fact that these are actually concepts that were used in the mines by the miners when they thought about the origins and the life of metals underground. Also because there's like in one of your maps at one point you actually I saw that a lot of spring waters were actually gathered around Lyon, which was a site of copper mining. And so it was very important for example, for the engraving industry, and there were actually pretty strong overlaps. And so I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about, you know, this sort of overlaps between these two fields. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This is really a question that aligns just so perfectly with my current interests. I am now writing on the history of copper and sort of, yeah, the imports of copper from Sweden into France. And yes, I'm also aware of the copper mines were in Lyon, the famille Jarre, and the sort of really important work on this. So there will be lots of things to say, but to actually cross these two things, I would say, first of all, when people are trying to survey and looking for waters, they do also pay attention to, I guess, geology, even though that's not always the term that's used, but they do pay attention to the minerals that might be around. So if there are, they actually talk relatively rarely about copper, but they talk often about iron, because iron is a very common product to be found in waters. Like they're trace amounts, but they're very easy to taste, because iron, even in extremely small amounts in water, has a distinctive taste, and it reacts really well to one of the most popular sort of reagents that is used, the oak gall tincture. So whenever, like, water is sometimes also used by people who write about water, will sometimes say, well, this water contains iron, so who knows, there might also be some iron ore around here. So there is like a little bit of overlap in the kind of surveying techniques for looking for mining for oil and looking for waters. Now in the kind of more like theories of generation on how metals, like sort of this like a tradition that comes more from alchemy, of like how metals are formed, and theories of where metals might be in the earth and where waters might be in the earth. There is a little bit of overlap also in the I would say in the actual difficulties of this kind of theory, because so lots and lots of like scientists or like physicians and savants who work on mineral waters throughout the 18th century try to understand how mineral waters are made, and why they spring where they spring. And sometimes some parts of it are very obvious, like, oh, there's a whole bunch of salt here and then there's a salt spring. Okay, this is not like completely crazy. But sometimes they find, for example, a metal a little bit dissolved in the water, and they know from their own sort of chemical knowledge that this metal is not dissolvable in water. Like, they can't recreate it in the lab. And so they sort of have these appeals to this like the high pressure of the underground, being able to create things that just are not possible to create in other kind of in the laboratory. So this is also a little bit where the overlap with alchemical theories exists, and this is something that I find really interesting, that they try to say, like, well, we don't know why this might be there, but this is probably because of these kind of underground combinations. And in that way, I think it is actually quite it's relatively similar, and there is a little bit of knowledge transference between the two. I would say there's one big difference, which is that most people who are doing like the chemistry that applies to mining and metallurgy do tend to have a bit of a different background. The people who work on mineral waters are almost always physicians, and they work in the medical field. Now, there are people who come from the medical field who work on metallurgy, but that is not as sort of omnipresent. So there's a little bit of a sort of institutional difference, and so that's why there's not always complete overlap between the theories that I use. But yeah, excellent question. Really interested in what you might have to say about the Lyon mines and everything. Please feel free to get in touch.
Daniele Cozzoli, can go.
Yes, thank you for your very interesting talk. I've been fascinated, but I must confess that I'm asking from the depth of my ignorance. So my questions are very maybe naive. I was thinking, and there's a question for Rebecca. Your fascinating history of the drop. I've never thought about the drop as unit, but in fact, most of our drugs are administered by drops. If you can tell something about the two categories that are a little bit in the shadow. One is the patient, because after all, drops are easy for the patient. So if a patient should have a quite sophisticated instrument of measure in order to have a very precise amount of medicine, that would basically be impossible. So if you can tell us something more about the patients, how they react, where they consider the center of the whole process, did they play any role in the fact that drops, after all, are still what we are using? And the second actor is manufacturers, because when it is an industrial production, of course, there are standards in the containers. So even if, of course, a drop is different from any other drop, there shouldn't be much difference in the end. And I suppose that manufacturers were eager to have smaller drops so that they can save their the substances. And for Armel, I have another very naive questions. I was a little bit was very interesting, but because your narrative spanned more than 1 century, and so in not only in the history of chemistry, but in the social and political and cultural history of France, and not only of France, happened in all this period too many things. So I wondered whether in the transition from the Ancien Regime, at the beginning, I thought you were focusing on the Ancien Regime, at least by reading your abstract. But then you ended up with the quotations from, from the Thermidor. So after the revolution, was there any major change, not only in the question of measurement, but also in the fact that the revolution introduced a very different view of education, also the use of waters, because, water, even mineral waters, were not any longer a commodity for nobles or rich or gentlemen. They and not only because of the revolution, but also because of the increasing role of towns in the east of Europe that needed much more water than before. So was there any change in soon after the revolution, or maybe not? That's it.
Please, Becca, go ahead. I've taken notes.
Thank you so much for these questions. I love both of these. So first question was about the role of the patient in this process. And the second one was, is there, in a sense, a way that drops have been standardized? So to go to the first question, and I think I might even just kind of direct a question to Armel to kind of keep the conversation going between our papers. The role of the patient. I think the first role of the patient in this process is actually their bodies, their physiological reaction to overdose. So something I didn't really go into is that the chloroform example and the ether example is not the only danger of overdose here. Like, one of the things they were concerned about with the non-uniformity of drops was that patients were overdosed, that this had happened. It was a concern, not with every medication, right? Not every medication is that sensitive, but with some of them. So I think the first role is just the patient's physiological reaction. And then, so there's also a transition that happens during this time from patients adding their own fluid to like a powdered medication versus getting a medication that's already pre-mixed. So that I think also kind of plays into what you're saying, that it's about accessibility of instruments. And what I think is so cool about this is that this is still a concern today. So if we're going to ship a medication to remote areas where you don't want to have to rely on a certain kind of measuring technology to be there, you want something that you can build into a bottle. So infant oral vaccines is a perfect example of that, of the drop being this like highly accessible and very easily understood unit. I kind of like got obsessed with drops when I started this project. Because at first I thought, like, we shouldn't be using drops. You know, this seems so unscientific. And the more that I looked into it and did my own experiments with drops, I was just like, this is this is a unit anyone anywhere can make. You know, I got really into it. So then there's the second question: are drops standard? So in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. So you're right that when a dropper is built into a medicine bottle, that is manufactured to give as similar of drops as possible, which is an important aspect of the drop actually being a viable unit throughout the course of the 19th century. Like we do have to get kind of more standard drops. But the thing that makes it kind of inherently non-standard is that, so there's this equation called Tate's equation, which models drop size. And that equation depends on the surface tension of the fluid. So as soon as you have a different fluid, you have a different equation, you have a different drop size. So you can standardize it roughly within a fluid, but as soon as you're changing to a new fluid with the same angle, the same temperature, the same dropper, you will have a different drop size. So in a sense, it's standard, in a sense, it's not. But I kind of wanted to direct the question about, I mean, in a sense, my patients are also my consumers. So I kind of wanted to ask Armel, is there a role that consumers play in this process? Like most of the story that you've been able to tell so far is about kind of the state-imposed analysis, but do consumers also play any role in analyzing mineral waters?
Yeah, thanks, Becca. This is a really interesting answer that you gave. And I can say, in general, my thesis is not very patient-centered. Unfortunately, there aren't many records of patients actually using the waters, with the exception of a couple of these sort of very elite cases. So I have found lots of little instances of yes, indeed, sort of patients sometimes having their own practices, and what you see throughout the medical literature is physicians and sort of medical professionals complaining that patients are listening to them and are just doing whatever they want and that aren't eating the right thing and are diluting too much or drinking too much of the water, etc. So there's a lot of patient agency that kind of gets read through between the lines, and that is something I'm really interested in, but that is not as much. I would find it difficult to say what influence that has on analysis, just because that hasn't been the main focus of my study. This is a really interesting question. And now I can transition to answering the question that was also asked. So yes, my doctoral study carries from the very late 17th century all the way to 1810. So I actually do have a look at the revolutionary period and the very early empire, as in Napoleonic Empire. So because I actually found that transition really fascinating, what happens at the revolution. So indeed, this seems like just a kind of prime, and especially the kind of institutional history part of my research, all the stuff about the Société de Médecine, it is so prime Ancien Regime. It's like these layers and layers of these committees that are all answering to the king, and this way of writing is just like really kind of very peak absolutist monarchy France thing. But I have really looked in detail at all of the sort of revolutionary kind of committees and decrees that were taken on mineral waters, and they are strikingly similar. So there is like the medical field gets a little bit reforged during the revolution, like the very strict separation between physicians, surgeons, and apothecary is a bit weakened, but it does actually keep going because the physicians really try to keep that sort of separation and that hierarchy. And in general, there's a lot of discussion during the revolution on because the royal structures that were administrating the spas obviously fall apart. So there's a lot of like individual entrepreneurs that try and buy these springs for, sometimes I've seen it being called like a vile price. So they go into an old spa town that is completely crumbling because it no longer has sort of any financial support, and they buy it for very cheap, and then they try to run it privately and make a lot of money off of it. There's a lot of debate about this in the sort of new revolutionary medical authorities that try to kind of bring back a bit of state power to support these communities that are, they call it being exploited by these greedy entrepreneurs. That's the kind of terms that they use. So there's still a lot of attempts at legislation almost right away to try and bring back this kind of remedy. But they follow actually a very similar route, and they try to bring some of the same scientists as from the Ancien Regime, the ones that survive. So like not Lavoisier, but Fourcroy becomes a really important administrator. He was a really important physician and administrator in the Ancien Regime, and he becomes a very important revolutionary figure. And he plays a role at the École de Santé, and they just try to reinstate similar kinds of sort of like chemistry-backed scientific surveys, and so there's a striking amount of similarity into the revolutionary period, and that is something that I find myself really, really interesting. Yeah,
thank you, Mauro Capocci.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you very much for these two very inspiring papers discussion. I have a question for Rebecca about the use of drops within the anesthesia and introduction of anesthesia. Have you tried to question the drops on the background of the relationship between the physician and the nurse? The thing is, drops as being a simpler way of knowing without the lack of any without the need of any instrument or whatever. So it's kind of something that can be given to an uneducated nurse to make use of. And then if this is a kind of establishing a hierarchy between the physician and nurse within the anesthesia field. Actually, anesthesia is quite a different thing all over the world, so that in the United States, nurse can administer anesthesia, while in Europe it's something very different. The relationship within nurse and physician and surgeons in anesthesia. So I don't know if there is something about it within the drops history.
Yes, there is. And it's not the thing that you think it is, but you're on the right track. So really, really interesting dynamics between nurse anesthetists and surgeons at this time. So first of all, nurse anesthetist is like not a thing. The fact that the Mayo Clinic is even allowing women to do this super important and dangerous job is grounds for them to actually get sued. And they have to argue for the legitimacy of them having this position, even as a part of their, of their staff. And they use Alice McGaw's papers actually in their arguments, and they win the case at the end. And that's the creation of the nurse anesthetist as a position. But the dynamic between the surgeon and the nurse. So I think something that actually sort of enables this professionalization of women into this role is that the drop method has to be done with like your full attention, whereas the kind of like pour a certain exactly measured amount and hold it to someone's face, like you're just doing that before the surgery, right? And because it was considered, like you said, like this really important process that only an educated physician should do, there was a choice of like, you're either going to be doing it yourself and you're risking your reputation because you could kill a patient, or you're giving up a little bit of your power with someone who can do the open drop method, because there's no option for the surgeon to do the open drop method and the surgery at the same time. Because the open drop method, I mean, it really is like it's a metal container with two spouts, one for small drops and one for big drops. And you're just holding it like this the entire time, staring at the patient the whole time. So this, I'm not sure if I have any evidence to think that the drops themselves were considered like inherently unscientific, actually, which is interesting. You would think that there'd be some kind of complaint, but I'm not even sure if it was really thought of as a unit exactly. I think basically what allows for this to happen is that there's just no deaths. Like with this method. I mean, it's hard for me to say 0 deaths, but 14,000 patients and no deaths, at least for those 14,000. So I think the giving up of a little bit of power is basically necessitated by wanting to protect one's reputation. And yeah, it's just like it's hard to argue with those results. So there definitely is a power dynamic there. And interestingly, this power dynamic really shifts in the 20th century when anesthesiology becomes acceptable for men to go into. Because it's some kind of ironic shift where it's like, first women can't go into it, and then it gets associated with nurses. And then doctors don't take it seriously. And it's not until like the 1950s, at least in the US context, which is kind of where anesthesiology as a medical research field gets taken very seriously. Yeah, it's not until the 1950s that this the switch gets made entirely. But yeah, I hope I answered your question, but I'll let Lavinia.
Yeah, you answered. Sorry, Lavinia, can I just go on?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, you answered this. I would suggest really to pay attention to the to other scenarios other than US, because actually US had a very peculiar dynamics in the establishing of any kind of medical professional, since you know that medical education was quite different in the old continent and the new world up until the 1910s. And actually that is the reason why, well, one of the reasons why you have nurse anesthesia in nurse anesthesiologist in the United States, while in other countries you don't have any nurse anesthesiologists, because you don't have any formal medical education up until the 1910s in the United States. So different population dynamics, geographical dynamics are at play in the United States, so that there were a lot of untrained professional just performing surgeries all around the United States. That means in the far west and the frontier, you get, you know, the old doc that administering anesthesia, but also just some kind of nurses around administering anesthesia. So I would suggest that for at least pay some attention to regional differences in these contexts of anesthesia. I don't know anything about drops and I don't know anything about these, but I've studied a little bit nurse anesthesia around the world, and I know that there were a lot of difference in establishing nurse anesthesia as a profession in the United States and in other contexts. So I would suggest actually the power dynamics are quite different at play. For example, in Germany, the surgeon was all powerful and the complete chief in the operation hall, while in United States there was more balance of power, while in the well, we don't know in UK another history follows from for anesthesia. So I would suggest an ongoing research in this context of anesthesia and drops of anesthesia, pay attention to the national context.
Yeah,
thank you, Mauro. Thank you, Mauro. Lavinia, you can go.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you. I have two very specific questions, one for Armel and one for Rebecca, and I will start with the 18th century. So like the question for Armel, I mean, as you maybe I told you, like I study like marshes and standing waters. So I kept wondering when you were discussing about these chemical analysis of like mineral waters, whether you think that, for example, like the potential, the commercial potential and economic importance of these bottled chemical mineral authors sort of like drove the creation of what you called, like, I think, as a proto-standard and a methodology, and whether these, have you seen this applied to other kinds of authors? Because, of course, I mean, these are authors which are to be used, and they have like also kind of they represent a sort of national, I use this term national, which is not really appropriate for the 18th century, but like they represent a pride for the kingdom, and the king is directly involved, as you mentioned, in like promoting these the development, these methodologies. So I was wondering whether there were some other applications. It's a bit a self-centered question, but it kind of relates, you know, because I always look for, you know, these chemical analysis of like standard waters, and I fail. I am not finding any. And my question for Rebecca is very, very general. So I was wondering whether there are other applications of the drop as a unit of measurements outside of medicine. And of course, I think your work is extremely important because it makes us rethink, you know, the role of standardization in the history of science and what kind of how it plays out. But I just wanted to know, you know, if you have worked also like on the drop outside of this context of like the patient based medicine, actually in other domains of knowledge. And this, as Daniele said, it's also a question that comes from ignorance because I don't know anything about that. So thank you.
Yes. So just to very briefly, this standard, so there are analyses of non-mineral waters. I have come across accidentally when looking for mineral water analyses. Sometimes it's like river water or lake water or something like this. So it does exist, but I think that mineral waters are very difficult to analyze because the concentrations are very small. They are very unstable products. So like plenty of talk about how difficult it is to do, but they are still, I think, easier to analyze than other kinds of waters because even though they contain small concentrations of minerals, they do contain still a relatively high amount compared to other kinds of natural waters. So I think my sort of loose hypothesis around this is that mineral waters became a really good kind of case study for chemists throughout the 18th century to kind of hone the craft of analysis. And you see it applied to other kinds of waters later, rather sort of in the late 18th century. I wouldn't be able to make a very definitive statement about this because I obviously focus on mineral waters, but that's my hypothesis, which might be of use to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so absolutely drops are used in many contexts. Just thinking about like cooking, the Tradesman magazine actually was not just apothecaries, but many trades, many crafts use drops. I think I focused on the use of drops that seemed the most risky, kind of the most surprising that you would use an imprecise unit. But I think there could be lots of interesting work to be done to see other examples of drops in situations might be not quite as dangerous, but still relevant and convenient. Actually, I got the idea to do this project by reading a biography of Pavlov. He used to use drops. He used drops as a way to measure the amount of salivation in his dogs. So he had some tubing that would connect with the saliva being produced, and he would basically ordinally rank their reaction based on the number of drops of saliva. And I found this really fascinating because he was so precise in all of his methodology. He would have his wife make observations because he didn't trust himself. So the fact that someone who had this really heavy emphasis on on precision, on control. He even had exact number of seconds that he would have his buzzes. People say that dogs responded to a bell, but a bell was like way too unruly. He had to have a buzzer that had, anyway. So point being, the fact that he would use this really kind of squishy unit surprised me. And so then it just got me thinking about what kinds of precision are important for what kind of knowledge claims, and it sent me down this entire spiral.
So if I may, before closing this first seminar of this early career seminar series of the Italian Society for the History of Science, I have a very brief question for both of you, and I want to thank you before for your two interesting papers. It's more methodological, so I've seen a lot of artifacts from museums and museums collections. So I was wondering what role play material culture in your research. So it's just a confirmation, it's the focus, it's one of the many sources you can use. So very briefly, just that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, a good broad sort of question to tie into both of our research. I suspect it will be probably a bit more present for Becca's work. I would say for me, not big enough of a role. Sadly, a lot of the material culture of this sort of early spa infrastructure has been lost. And this has been a great personal tragedy for me, that of course spas are much more associated with the 19th, especially the sort of like early 20th century or even interwar period of these beautiful Art Deco decorated towns that had all of the, artists and people who would meet. And spas are much more associated with this, but it means that all of this infrastructure sits on top of the 18th century infrastructure, which was extremely simple and a bit pitiful and often wood that would always rot and always, 18th century spas are always described as very muddy and unpleasant places, but that also means that a lot of its material culture has not survived. And I have never myself seen in person an actual bottle used. I know some people have them, but they're expensive on eBay, so I have not gotten one. So the only kind of material culture aspect that I have used is that I have actually gone out of my way to go visit a number of these spas that were discovered or repopularized during the 18th century, to at the very least being able to taste the waters myself and to get a sense of what it's like to bathe in them, and I think that's actually been strangely instructive to actually understand what, for example, like an iron water tastes like. It tastes disgusting, but extremely strong. It's unmissable. And to me, that really kind of helped me understand what it was to have this kind of sensorial approach to the water. So for me, material culture has been more the intangible sensorial culture, just due to a lack of archaeological remains. But yeah, I'm really interested to hear Becca's perspective on this.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a great question because, I mean, like I said, I could not find any actual metamometers. They're tiny glass tubes. I really doubt any of them have survived, but it has really got me thinking about how the absence of material can also be instructive for projects. So like I did a lot of empirical work to understand this whole drop thing. I dropped, I think it was over 500 drops in different iterations, like to figure out how Tate's equation worked. I modeled it to figure out which angle made the most consistent drop size. I got a little obsessed. I used seriological pipettes as the closest analog to minimometers to figure out how the suction works. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out, because I'm just not familiar with seriological pipettes, why the numbers seemed entirely backwards until I figured out how it worked. And then I realized, oh, okay, you're kind of keeping track of what's been deposited. And then I went down this whole rabbit hole of what does it mean for a device to be calibrated to contain versus to deliver? And when do we get this distinction? And all that to say, without the minimometer, I think I actually got a really good grasp of what it would be like to be reading this pharmacopoeia and see this like glass tube that you're supposed to have and maybe not have it. And maybe you procure it and maybe it's disappointing, maybe you don't understand it. And to not have an instrument, I think, is also really instructive, that you have to work through what maybe someone had to work through when they didn't have their own instrument and had to make one or find one or figure out how it worked. The paper that I wrote with Claudia Cristoli in Nuncius actually worked through a very similar problem where we were trying to recreate an experiment with pressure sensation, and we realized that the instrument didn't exist or we couldn't find it, so we had to make our own pressure balance to test our own pressure sensation. And that process of trying to make the instrument actually taught us a lot about why these kind of weird aspects of the method of experimentation were even there. And we wouldn't have realized it without kind of trying to struggle to make an instrument which didn't, exist anymore. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I had none of the materials to do this paper. And in some sense, I'm kind of glad that I didn't, because I learned a lot along the way.
So thank you. It's so beautiful to meet Nuncius authors in another context. So I think that so we can close this first seminar. And so the second seminar we have at the end of April, so the 30th, if I'm right. And so thank you to Lavinia for organizing this series. Thank you for the speaker, Armel and Rebecca. So I've learned a lot, and at the beginning I told you that it was a way of connecting, and so yeah, no new things, new person, and I think that we reach the goal, and so I'm very happy, and I really thank you and all the attendants. So Lavinia, if you want to say something, please.
Oh, I also wanted to thank the two speakers, Rebecca and Armel, for giving two presentations that albeit being very different in terms of like chronological focus and also like problems, epistemological and epistemic problems. They allowed us, to create a dialogue. And actually, I've been very happy. I think I can speak for everyone here who remained, that, you also created the dialogue between yourselves. So I think is very nice. And yeah, so thank you. Thanks again for the... And if you want to participate in the next session, Gabriele is the person who asked you a question, Armel, and he's going to be in the next session. Of course, there's no obligation, but if you just want to, it's going to be a longer session, because we have 3 speakers instead of 2. So yeah, probably will last even longer. So I'm happy actually that we kept talking, and yeah, we kept asking questions, and you also articulated your answers very broadly and very interestingly. So thank you. Thanks again.
So thank you, and have a nice evening wherever you are.
Thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.